Calvin had always cherished the quiet strength of his land. His farm, a modest 5-acre stretch nestled just beyond the last stoplight of town, had been his haven for over 2 decades. After a long career in the U.S. Army, he hadn't wanted parades or medals, just peace. A place where the morning sun greeted rows of vegetables, chickens clucked contentedly in the coop, and the wind carried nothing but the scent of soil and sky. For years, Calvin's only neighbors had been cornfields, deer, and the occasional beat-up truck rattling down the gravel road. But that calm was slowly swallowed by creeping suburbia. What once was open land was now crammed with identical houses, same gray roofs, same polished mailboxes, same artificial smiles. A pristine new subdivision had sprouted like a weed right against his boundary line, bringing with it something far worse than noise, the homeowners association. At first, Calvin tolerated it. Let them trim their hedges with laser precision and vote on mailbox designs. As long as they stayed off his land, he stayed off theirs. It wasn't a treaty, but it was peace. That changed one morning. The air was crisp, the sky brilliantly blue, and Calvin was elbow-deep in straw, feeding his chickens. Then movement. Not a bird, not a raccoon. 2 men, strangers, strolling through his field like they owned the soil beneath their feet. They wore crisp navy polos embroidered with HOA patrol, smug expressions, and an air of entitlement that stuck out like a weed in a wheat field. One held a clipboard, the other a glowing tablet. They didn't belong, not on his land. Wiping his hands on his jeans, Calvin approached them. "Can I help you?" he asked, his voice calm, but the steel beneath it unmistakable. "Routine inspection," the clipboard man replied, cheerful as if they were discussing the weather. "For what?" "Community standards, sir. All properties in the district must comply." Calvin's jaw clenched. "This property isn't in your district. Never has been." Tablet man chimed in. "Actually, sir, recent maps show you're trespassing," Calvin cut in, voice now sharp. "No warrant. No invitation. Turn around and leave." A flicker of hesitation. "Then, we'll note your concerns. But we encourage you to read the guidelines. Might save you some trouble." They retreated without another word. Calvin stood alone in his field, blood simmering. This wasn't just intrusion. It was a test, one he had no intention of failing. Later, with callous fingers flipping through dusty deeds, Calvin confirmed what he already knew in his bones. His land was legally exempt from any HOA nonsense. But a few days later, they came back. He saw them near his chicken coop, snapping pictures, pointing like surveyors staking a claim. Calvin didn't wait. He marched straight up to the line. "I told you to stay off my land," he barked. "We're on public easement." One of them replied smugly. "You're harassing me. We're documenting potential violations. You don't have jurisdiction. Next time, I'm calling the sheriff." They walked off again, smirking, but the fight was escalating. The next few weeks, Calvin was watched like a criminal. A black SUV parked near his fence line. Men with binoculars. A measuring tape pressed against his handmade wooden fence. Every time he confronted them, they deflected. Just routine. Just protocol. Enough. Calvin fortified his property. Security cameras, motion-activated, high-resolution. He started a log. Photos, license plates, times, everything. He spoke to neighbors. Some rolled their eyes. Others, voices hushed, admitted they'd been fined for things as absurd as flower height or paint color. Calvin's land might be safe legally, but the HOA was playing a longer game, intimidation through persistence. He wouldn't be worn down. By the end of the month, Calvin had a thick binder full of evidence, pictures, letters, timestamps. It wasn't just documentation. It was armor. Proof that the little patch of earth he'd built with his own hands wasn't just under attack, it was being slowly, deliberately encroached upon. Then came the letter. A thick, white envelope, no postage, hand-delivered. The HOA's logo gleamed at the top. Inside, accusations. Violations. His barn, his fencing, his livestock, all cited as unsightly and non-compliant. 2 weeks to fix everything or face fines and legal action. Calvin read it standing on his porch, jaw tight. How dare they? How could they claim control over something they didn't own? He folded the letter slowly, slid it into his coat pocket, and stared out at his land. His land. Not theirs. Not now. Not ever. They wanted a fight? They just found the wrong damn farmer. Calvin had always cherished the rhythm of his quiet, rural life. His 5-acre farm, tucked just outside a modest town, had been his refuge for over 2 decades. a haven he'd built with calloused hands and military discipline after retiring from the army. Here, he'd raised livestock, tilled the earth, and healed the invisible wounds war had left behind. It was peace, not just of place but of spirit. But that peace had begun to fracture. A sprawling new housing development had appeared like an unwelcome shadow. Perfectly aligned houses with artificial turf and rules for everything from grass height to curtain colors. At first, Calvin didn't mind. Let them manicure their postage stamp lawns. He figured if they respected the boundary lines, he'd return the favor. But one morning, the illusion shattered. He was in his barn feeding the hens when he spotted two men in matching polos striding across his field like they owned it. They weren't just trespassing, they were inspecting. One had a clipboard. The other clutched a sleek tablet like it was a badge of authority. Calvin stepped out of the barn slowly, wiping grit and feed dust from his hands. "You're on private land," he said, voice low but unmistakably firm. The one with the clipboard barely blinked. "Morning, sir. Just a routine compliance inspection." "For what?" Calvin asked, eyes narrowing. "Community standards. We're making sure all properties are aligned with the Homeowners Association guidelines." Calvin crossed his arms. "This isn't your community. This farm predates your HOA by 15 years. The man with the tablet didn't flinch. "Our maps say otherwise." Calvin felt his blood begin to rise. "I didn't invite you here. This is trespassing. Leave." They backed off, but their smug expressions said this wasn't over. And it wasn't. Days later, they returned, this time staying just outside his fence, snapping pictures of his chicken coop like it was a crime scene. "You're harassing me?" Calvin barked, marching to the edge of his property. "Back off or I'll call the sheriff." One of them smirked. "We're on a public easement." It was clear they were probing, baiting, pushing boundaries. Literally. Calvin, ever the soldier, began logging every sighting. He installed security cameras. He spoke to neighbors and unearthed a chilling pattern. The HOA was power drunk, issuing fines for trivial infractions, intimidating elderly couples, and now, trying to claim land they had no authority over. Then the letter came, a cold, corporate envelope with accusations. His barn was an eyesore, his livestock violated aesthetic harmony, his fence too rustic. He had 2 weeks to comply or face fines and legal action. Calvin stared at the paper, fury bubbling under his stoic surface. He dug out his original deeds and zoning paperwork, then marched straight to the county office. There, a clerk confirmed what Calvin knew in his bones. The farm was agricultural, independent, untouchable by HOA clause. With proof in hand, Calvin sent a formal letter back, including copies of his documents and a demand they cease all further communication. But they weren't done. Another letter arrived, this one even bolder. They argued that while technically his farm wasn't under HOA governance, its visual impact on nearby property values gave them grounds to enforce compliance. It was lunacy, and Calvin knew lunacy unchecked becomes precedent. He visited neighbors, some sympathetic, others too frightened to speak. A young mother named Sarah whispered her story, fined for having a mailbox one shade off regulation white, threatened with losing pool access when she questioned it. Others had moved out entirely, bullied into submission. That same day, Calvin hired a lawyer, Rebecca, a tenacious property rights specialist who, upon hearing his story, leaned back in her chair and said they picked the wrong farmer. Together, they built a case. Calvin documented everything: patrols, photos, license plates. He spoke to the press, and the town newspaper ran a story. Veteran farmer battles overreaching HOA. It sparked a fire. Locals rallied. Others from different towns wrote letters of support. That fire only fanned when a security camera captured a patrol car creeping onto his land. At night. Headlights off. Calvin forwarded the footage to Rebecca. "That's the final nail," she said. "We sue." The lawsuit made waves. Rebecca filed for harassment, trespassing, and defamation. The HOA responded with its own lawyered-up threats. But Calvin wasn't afraid of a courtroom. He'd been through worse. As the trial neared, more disturbing details surfaced. Rebecca's subpoena revealed the HOA had pulled similar stunts before, targeting vulnerable property owners, filing unauthorized liens, quietly absorbing land into their governance by intimidation. This wasn't about aesthetics. It was control. When the court date arrived, the room was packed. Reporters, townsfolk, veterans, families. Rebecca presented the mountain of evidence like a surgeon with a scalpel. Camera footage, zoning maps, eyewitnesses, and a blistering testimony from an elderly neighbor harassed for having too many gnomes. The HOA's defense crumbled. Their president, under oath, admitted they had never verified Calvin's exclusion from their jurisdiction. The judge looked over her glasses with disgust. When the verdict came, Calvin stood as Judge Polk ruled in his favor. The HOA had no legal claim, had engaged in repeated harassment, and would be fined and permanently barred from interfering with his property. Outside the courthouse, Calvin exhaled for what felt like the first time in months. Reporters swarmed, but he had only one thing to say. This land is mine. I earned it. And no one, not a title-waving bureaucrat or a suburban patrol, gets to tell me otherwise. He turned toward his truck, the spring sun glinting off its hood, and headed home. Back to his farm. Back to peace. And back on his terms.